Mr. Yassukovich, thank you for joining me today. Welcome to Official Clues of Success, where we go into all the success. I always like to start with the basics, which is just what was your childhood like, and how did you come to be?
Okay, well, my childhood was a bit unusual because I was actually born in Paris. My father was running the Paris office of the American investment banking house White Weldon Co., of which he was a partner. He had been hired, in fact, right after the crash in 1929. Amazingly, White Weld had a very bright idea at the time. They realized that in Europe, the war clouds were gathering, things were really going down fast. The French franc was falling out of bed. And in those days, there wasn't much in the way of exchange control. So a great many Europeans, and particularly the French, were desperate to get their savings into America. And so Whitewell hired my father to set up an international department, a foreign department, they called it in those days, because he spoke lots of languages. He'd been working already for a Wall Street house that specialized in international arbitrage. So in 1933, he went to Europe. He first opened an office in London and then in Paris in the Champs-Élysées. And it was a huge success. I mean, there were lines forming out in the Champs-Élysées of French people wanting to open accounts at White Well to get their money into safety in America. So we were living in Paris, and I was born in a nursing home on the outskirts of Paris in 1935. Then, of course, the war came. I actually have a recollection. I would have been 4 years old. We were on holiday in Vichy, and there was a big sound truck outside. We were on the balcony, and the sound truck, which had these two huge megaphones on the roof, was announcing the invasion of Poland. This
Wow.
was August of 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. And of course, that triggered the entry of France and England into the war. I remember standing on the balcony hearing this. I wasn't quite sure what it all meant at the time, but I do have that vision in mind. We then took ship for America. My father remained to close down the office in Paris. He didn't close down the office in London, actually. He didn't actually mention that to his partners, but the office in London stayed open throughout the war. But we then went to New York, and we were very nicely received by my father's partners. They looked after us, and we first settled into a hotel in New York City, the Carlyle Hotel. And then ultimately we ultimately moved out to Long Island, where I grew up. So that's how I got to America and how I got to what was a very privileged part of America. The North Shore of Long Island had been developed by a number of the very wealthy families from New York City and Philadelphia, etc. It had Long Island was originally potato fields, basically. And a lot of people bought estates there back at the turn of the century and created very English style type of estates. And that's where we grew up. I was surrounded by people from that part of the world. I went to primary school there, and then I went on to a quite famous prep school called Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts, which was headmastered by a celebrated headmaster called Frank Boyden, who had started the school way, way back when. When I was there, he was already in his mid 70s, but he was still going strong. And it was a fine school, and it had a beautiful location, a lovely village in western Massachusetts, which had been the subject of a famous Indian raid where they had they'd killed all the men and taken the women and children off to what is now Canada, where they were in captivity for 7 years before they eventually were returned. This was during what was known as the French and Indian Wars. Anyway, Deerfield was nestled in the Pocumtuck Valley, beautiful views on the mountains there. And of course, during the very colorful period of the fall leaves, it was really quite a great school, I must say. I wasn't a very good student, but I certainly enjoyed it. And then in those days, it was easy to get into university if you came from the right school. And even though I'd had really a relatively poor scholastic record, I had to go to summer school one summer. I applied to both Harvard and Princeton, and I got admitted to Harvard. I got admitted to both, amazingly. In those days, we took something called the college entrance exam, and I somehow managed to pass. But I chose Harvard instead of Princeton, so I ended up at Harvard. So that's my those are my beginnings, and they were unusual in the sense that we were a very European family. My father was a white Russian emigre who had left after the Bolshevik Revolution, and my mother was French. And we had a rather European household. We lived in a very European fashion. I remember I used to envy my friends who were able to walk into the kitchen, open the fridge, and pull out a bottle of Coca Cola. We weren't even allowed to have Coca Cola in the house at home. So I had a rather a European environment growing up, and we spoke French at home. So I was always bilingual. My father obviously spoke French, but my mother didn't speak Russian. I learned a little bit of Russian because my father had a lot of Russian friends that used to come. My sister and I used to listen to them chatting. And so, children pick up languages quite easily. They forget them just as easily. But anyway, so those are my beginnings.
Wait, would you say you found your purpose? Like you knew, okay, I want to go into finance, or did you
Well,
find purpose accidentally, or did you know very early on what you wanted to do?
it wasn't really accidental. And I can't say that I had early on a very distinct idea about a career, but I didn't have a very close relationship with my father. He was really quite formal, and he had been brought up in the nursery, and he was not accustomed to a lot of contact with his children. But he explained to me one day that if I wasn't quite sure what sort of branch of industry or commerce I might want to go into, and he made it quite clear to me that I was going to have to go somewhere to earn a living. He wasn't going to help me further than a certain point. Investment banking, he said, will put you in every business because you will be exposed every day from this business, that business, the oil business, the transport business, because that's what investment bankers do. We raise capital for every aspect of industry and commerce. And therefore, you will become familiar with every field of industry and commerce, and you will have a much more interesting time than if you just go and work for an oil company or you go and work for a retail company. At White Weld, you will see a bit of everything. And that intrigued me. And I then began to, well, I just began to accept that that was likely to be my ultimate career choice. It just sounded more interesting than just going into one particular branch of industry or commerce.
Did he have that conversation with you when you were in high school, or was this at when you were at Harvard? When did
Yeah, this was when I was still in Deerfield. So yes, this would have been when I was in my teens. Yeah, I even remember almost where we had that conversation in our house on Long Island, and it made an impression on me. Subsequently, he used that same argument to build his team in White Wells Foreign Department. He engaged some interesting young people using that pitch, saying, well, you may wonder what kind of business you want to be in. Come into investment banking. You'll be in every business, and you'll see a much greater variety of the economic world.
was your father your mentor, you would say?
Well, in a sense, he was. Yes, I would say that I inherited very much his. He had a very strong sense of ethics. He felt that. I mean, he was very proud of the fact that he had been accepted as a partner of White Weld, which was pretty well populated by the kind of old New England families. The Wells were originally a Boston family. The Whites had at one point owned significant real estate on what was Brooklyn, became Brooklyn. And so it was a firm which had a strong family tradition. And my father was, first of all, very kind of proud that he had been accepted as a partner. And he was very keen on the atmosphere that existed in that firm, which was really based on maintaining the firm's reputation above anything else. They were not, they realized that, there'd be good years and bad years. Mind you, you see, in those days, Wall Street was populated by a lot of people who already had quite a bit of money. They'd all inherited fortunes of one sort or another. So they weren't really troubled. They realized that there were going to be good years and bad years, but they weren't living on their annual bonus or anything like that. They were perfectly happy, and their lifestyle wasn't affected if they happened to have a bad year. And they considered that the most important thing was maintaining the reputation of the firm.
Hmm.
And they would turn down business if they thought it would be bad for their reputation. I mean, they had a long-term approach to their business.
Interesting.
And I took that very much on board. And during my whole career, I was very much influenced by that ethos, if you like, that kind of attitude.
That's interesting. And how would you like, how important do you think mentorship is to anyone who wants to be successful? Do you think you need a mentor, or do you think it's not mandatory? What would you
Yeah,
say?
I think it's certainly not mandatory, but I think it is extremely helpful because you know if you go back to the 19th century, even the early 20th century, the concept of apprenticeship was very established in almost every activity. Everybody started as an apprentice, and they started in Wall Street and in the City of London, the financial center of the UK, as an intern, if you like, but they would be assigned to a senior person in a particular department. And you actually learned the business that way. You learned it from somebody who'd been doing it for quite a long time. And that's basically because I obviously, well, as you'll eventually learn, I never got any degree of any kind, and I certainly never had an MBA. And so I learned investment banking from the older people in the firm, from sitting at their feet. I was from one department to another. I was at one point, there was a fellow who ran the investment management department. It was called Frank Ritker, and he was very much of a guru. He was very much into growth stocks at a time when they were not yet as fashionable as they became. And I always remember him asking me a question. He's saying, "Okay, now which do you think is the conservative investment, a U.S. Steel or IBM?" So I thought, I know this is a trick question. Obviously, a steel company is kind of, kind of very staid. And I said, well, I guess it's got to be U.S. Steel. No, no, he said the conservative investment is IBM because IBM is growing and adding value every year where U.S. Steel isn't going anywhere. So the conservative investment is IBM. So you see, that's how I picked up all this stuff. I didn't read a lot of textbooks. I really learned everything from the older people in the firm and from other people, friends of my father who were also in other firms in Wall Street. And I would listen to them talking. So I think mentorship or the opportunity to sort of sit at the feet, so to speak, of somebody who's got experience is hugely important, hugely important.
And I find that very impressive that you were able to do all those things without actually, completing university. And when did you make up your mind that you wanted to start writing books?
Oh, well, that came a lot later as a sort of hobby. First of all, I had a very, very good teacher in English composition at Deerfield. He's called Mr. McGlynn. He was really an Irishman, and he was an outstanding teacher of English and English literature. And he gave me the incentive to write. Then at my first year at Harvard, there was a compulsory course. I wonder whether there still is one, but there was a compulsory course in English composition. The point was that you were going to have to be submitting papers, thesis, and all the rest of it. And you should learn how to write the language properly and how to avoid repetition and jargon and all this kind of thing. And I really enjoyed that course. And so I really started writing as a hobby. And
Wow.
I enjoyed the preparation of documents, and I enjoyed writing the description of a company in a prospectus for an offer of shares or bonds. I did when I was starting out. I did a lot of proofreading of offer documents. So I liked the language. I could write and still can in both English and French. My spelling is bad in both. I must say I rely hugely on spell check because I keep getting the French spelling confused with the English spelling. But no, it really started as a hobby, writing books.
And what are some of the most proudest moments of your career?
Well, I suppose, first of all, I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time because after I did my stint in the Marine Corps, I got a job very easily with my father's firm. And accidentally, because somebody had left, anyway, there was a sudden gap in the London office, and I was sent there initially as assistant to the manager. And I was only going to be there for 6 months, but then I just stayed. And it was just when the euro markets were beginning. You see, there was a huge pool of US dollars washing around in Europe, mostly from the Marshall Plan. And because the American corporates were investing heavily in Europe, they were setting up businesses there. So there were a lot of dollars washing around. And it became obvious that those dollars could be used within the European time zone. Banks could take them on deposit in London and lend them out. And we started doing capital market transactions in US dollars, which were known as euro dollars at the time because they were circulating in Europe. Obviously, everything was getting cleared through the Fed system, but it was really being it was the beginnings of an international capital market, and I just happened to be there. And White Whale had the strongest presence of any of the Wall Street firms, due to my father having set up offices in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. And then after the war, he set an office up in Zurich. And so I got very engaged in that activity. And obviously, I remember my first deal. I was originally assigned to Norway. Now, Norway kind of belonged to Hambros Bank in London, which was a bank that had been founded by a Danish family back in the 18th century, but it was a merchant bank that was specialized in Scandinavia, in the Norwegian shipping business. And I mean, they were so ensconced that even the school books, Norwegian children who went to school, they saw Hambros Bank mentioned as a typical international bank. And if it wasn't Hambros in London, it was Kuhn Loeb in New York that had a privileged position. But we made a market in Norwegian bonds. And I also had well, I'll tell you what happened. The first General Secretary of the United Nations was a Norwegian called Trygve Lie. He was a statesman. And he was the first Secretary General when the United Nations was set up in Lake Success. Now, Trygve Lie was a client of White Whale. He was a client of my father's. He opened an account at White Whale when he was in the States. So my father gave me an introduction to Trygve Lie. And Trygve Lie made a date with me to meet him in the bar of the Grand Hotel in Oslo. Now, everybody in Oslo walked through the Grand Hotel on their way to the bar, which opened up at 5 in the afternoon. So the whole of Oslo, which is not a huge community, saw me sitting there having a drink with Trygve Lie. And so when I started going around making calls, everybody said, "Oh, you're a friend of Trygve Lie." I said, "Well, my father is a friend of Trygve Lie." And so I was in. And I then had an idea. Hambros, when they've been putting syndicates together for Norwegian bond issues, they had been treating the local banks kind of, as of no importance. And there was exchange control. So, in theory, the local banks couldn't really underwrite a foreign currency based security. But I said to myself, I'm going to get one of these Norwegian banks, local banks, to help me get a deal. And I went to Andresen's Bank, which was a private bank, and I found somebody who was very keen to help me. I then eventually approached the official at the finance department and said, look, I know that the bank is obviously subject to exchange control, but if ever they have to pick up their underwriting, we White Whale will stand behind it. So they will not be at risk of owning a foreign currency security. So I was able to make the two Norwegian banks part of the syndicate, and I got the mandate for a hydroelectric project called Oplatskraft. At the time, this was before the Norwegians realized they had a whole bunch of oil offshore, and they were depending on hydropower, which they had huge amounts of because there are all these mountains up north, and they were they were fueling their aluminum business with hydropower, etc. And then I got another one after that. So I got these two mandates. I was very young, and I had landed a piece of business right under the noses of Hambros Bank. I was really proud of that. And that taught me a lesson. Always get the cooperation of the local banks. When you're doing international business, don't neglect the local banks because they're just local banks. Get them on side, and that will help you. I never forgot that lesson.
Wow. You did that first transaction. That was
I think
very
I guess I was 27, 28, something like that.
and
Yeah.
you
I was just an assistant. I mean, I was a registered representative. I wasn't even an assistant manager yet at White Weld in London.
wow.
But I was very pleased with that. And then obviously later on, I did some fairly famous transactions. I was much involved in the first capital market operations of what was then the European Economic Community before it became the EU. And I did. We introduced U.S. companies to the euro markets, and then I did a management buyout for the Gulfstream Corporation, which was a very unusual deal at the time. And I went on the board of Gulfstream. I was the only member of the board of Gulfstream that didn't have a pilot's license. I remember. But that was when I was running a consortium bank. But no, I had a busy time because I was in the place where all the action was. London took over very quickly from New York as the international financial center. And that was as a result of a decision made during the Kennedy administration, which turned out to be the wrong decision. But the US began to be concerned about running an external deficit because US companies were investing abroad at a high rate. And they were therefore exporting dollars rather more than foreign currency that was coming in by people investing in America. I mean, nowadays, nobody worries about deficits anymore. But at that point, it was during the Kennedy administration, so they instituted something called the interest equalization tax, which was designed basically to tax the income on bonds issued by foreign issuers in New York. At that point, obviously, no foreign issuer was going to issue in New York anymore, and they just went straight to London, where we had all the same facilities and where we had a huge, if you like, investor audience because European investors always have bonds in their portfolios and they loved having US dollar bonds. The US dollar was king. And so we were able to accomplish everything out of London that had previously been accomplished out of New York. Plus, we didn't have to go through SEC registrations and so on. And so that market just boomed. And at that stage, obviously, most of the Wall Street houses opened up in London. A lot of the commercial banks bought London-based firms, and London just blossomed and became the global financial center. It was also very nicely positioned between Tokyo and New York in terms of time zone. So positions that were taken in Tokyo could be partly unwound in London and then again in New York and all the rest of it. So it was, and it had all the facilities. It had legal facilities, technical facilities. Obviously, English was the language of world trade and commerce and finance. So yeah, it was the place to be, and I just happened to be lucky to be there.
What is Park Place Capital?
Sorry.
What is Park Place Capital? How did that come?
Barclays Capital, well, that was a hedge fund company that I had at one point when I was working for an Italian entrepreneur called Sergio Cagnotti, who wanted to set up a merchant bank in London. He'd hired a very bright fellow who ran our securities trading and then went off to set up his own investment management firm, which was essentially an alternative investment firm, a hedge fund. His wife worked for Morgan Stanley, funnily enough, and he asked me to chair his board, which I did. I ended up as a non-executive chairman of quite a few companies, but that's what Park Place Capital was. I think he's now retired and folded it up, but he was he was quite a good operator.
You come off as a really fearless person. Do you think that is what you need in a sense to be successful? Like, do you think it's okay to be afraid sometimes? Or do you think our goal should be to eliminate fear?
I think one should eliminate fear because fear, first of all, is basically debilitating, and it shatters one's confidence. And confidence, self-confidence, is critical in the financial world because you are interfacing with people who are relying on you, whether they're relying on you to invest their money or whether they're relying on you to raise money for them, which are the two functions of investment banking after all. They are placing their confidence in you. And if you show any sign of uncertainty or lack of confidence or fear, that's going to hurt their confidence. So the business is very much based on confidence and trust. Oh, even more than, I mean, nowadays, obviously, because of the technology involved in finance, uh, technological skills play a greater role than they did in my day. But it is still a business at the end of the day based on mutual confidence between client and banker. So I never felt that I was an expert in particular. I mean, okay, I'd been taught to read company reports and balance sheets from the back forward. Always read the notes first because that's usually where the real meat is. It's in the notes, and that's where things tend to get hidden as well. But I wouldn't say that I was a trained financial analyst. I certainly wasn't. I mean, I spent time in the investment department. I mean, you know, when I started at Whitewell, we were using slipsticks, you know, before that we these funny little calculators. And I don't think I could claim any particular level of technical expertise. What I was good at, I think, was presentation, and I could present well. That's why I was a popular speaker at conferences. I mean, as this market grew bigger and bigger, you know, they started having endless conferences of one kind or another. There was a magazine called Euromoney, which actually I helped to float it. And it was sort of the magazine for the international capital market, and they ran the league tables, and that's where people advertised their business and so on. And they ran a series of conferences. And obviously, conferences were a bit of a perk for the employees. They got to go to a conference in this city or that city. And I was frequently a speaker about what was happening in the capital markets. But as I say, I think I think being an all-arounder is more important than being a specialist in one narrow area. Unfortunately, what we've seen developing in higher education and in career development is an increase in specialities rather than an all-rounder. Now, to be an all-rounder, you're not going to be a particular specialist in any one aspect, but you will still be able to talk about any one aspect, and you will know how to find a colleague who is a specialist in that aspect. And I always used to say, when somebody will ask me a question, I would say, well, I don't know the answer, but I know someone who does. And, I ended up knowing a lot of people and a lot of people who were expert in different areas. And I wouldn't try and fake it. If I didn't think I had an answer to the question, I would usually be able to find somebody who would come up with the answer. But I think the world has moved far too far, I think, towards specialization. And some people can make a perfectly good career as a specialist in one very narrow field. But generally speaking, I think in finance, in investment banking, or even in commercial banking, I think a broad knowledge is better than a very intensely specialized knowledge in one thing.
What wisdom would you like to leave to the next generation?
I would say, first of all, make sure you read and understand history. History, unfortunately, is a subject which is kind of being dropped or is being neglected.
Ooh.
And history is unbelievably important to understanding what's going on at the moment. It's not that history repeats itself exactly, of course it doesn't. But unless you know history, you find it far more difficult to analyze current situations. So I would say make sure that you read history, that you know as much history as you can about whatever field you're in, because it's going to help you to deal with the current problems that come up. And the next thing I would say is try to be as much of an all rounder as possible, because if you're in any business which requires building client confidence, if you can talk about more than one thing, the client is going to be more comfortable. He's going to say to himself, this chap seems to know quite a few things. I think he's more likely to be able to solve my problem than someone who can't talk about several things, because it's all about problem solving at the end of the day. That's what in finance, that's what one is doing. One is basically solving people's problems, how to invest their money or how to raise money for their business or for the expansion of their business. So those are the two things I would say. Try and have as good a knowledge of history as possible, and try and be an all-rounder. Even if you are working in one particular field, make sure you also find people or talk to people who are working in associated fields, and so that you can also talk a little bit about what they're up to.
Wow. Well, Mr.
Your equity man should also be able to talk about bonds and vice versa.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Yassukovich. You've
Okay.
given us a lot of wisdom today. We appreciate that. The next generation will appreciate this.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, do stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.